In 1694, a column of Portuguese soldiers and mercenaries pushed into the Serra da Barriga, hauling artillery through a jungle that had been resisting expeditions for decades. It wasn't the first time the colonial army had tried to destroy what was up there. They had sent troops before, many times, and every time they came back empty-handed or with casualties nobody wanted to count. But this time, they arrived with more men, more resolve, and a clear order. Finish off Palmares for good. The question worth asking is why an empire needed nearly a century to bring down a community of people who, on paper, had nothing. The answer starts much earlier, in the sugar mills of northeastern Brazil. Throughout the 17th century, colonial Brazil was one of the most profitable pieces of the Atlantic system. The sugar economy ran on one thing: massive, unpaid labor. To keep it going, Portugal and the merchants operating under its crown transported millions of people from the African continent under conditions of systematic violence. The mills of the Northeast consumed human life like fuel. The work was grueling, punishment was brutal, and life expectancy inside the system was short. Pernambuco and the surrounding territories held enormous concentrations of enslaved people, whose labor kept sugar flowing across the Atlantic to European markets. Within that system, escape was both dangerous and common. People who managed to flee the mills looked for places beyond the reach of colonial authority. Those refugees were called quilombos, and they existed throughout colonial Brazil. They were communities of runaways trying to live outside the control of slaveholders and officials. Most quilombos were small, temporary, and vulnerable. Capture expeditions dismantled them. But in the region of the Serra da Barriga, in what is now the state of Alagoas, something different was taking shape. Palmares was not a village. It was a network. A series of connected settlements called mocambos spread across the slopes and valleys of a mountain range that made things extremely difficult for any outside army. Elevation, dense vegetation, and paths that the inhabitants knew and the invaders did not. The main settlement, known as Macaco, held thousands of people. Estimates vary depending on the source and the period, but at its peak, the total population across the Palmares network may have exceeded 20,000. For a colonial system that measured power through control and extraction, that number was an unsustainable anomaly. The people who built Palmares came from very different backgrounds. Many had been brought from the African continent, from different regions and traditions, speaking different languages, carrying different religious practices, having survived different crossings. Others had been born in colonial Brazil, in conditions of enslavement, or on the edges of the system. Some records suggest the presence of indigenous people who found in Palmares a space outside the colonial orbit. What connected them was not a shared origin, but a shared condition. They had escaped a system that treated them as property, and they had found a way to organize so they would not be taken back. That organization was not improvised. Palmares developed forms of governance, hierarchies, labor systems, defense structures, and ways of integrating the new runaways who kept arriving. They farmed, raised animals, and in some cases traded with nearby communities. They had recognized leaders whose authority came not from a crown or a colonial institution, but from the community itself. It was not a utopia. There were internal tensions, disputes over resources, disagreements about how to deal with the outside world. But it was a functioning society, one that managed to sustain itself for decades under constant threat. For colonial authorities and plantation owners, Palmares was a problem that went far beyond numbers. The real danger was not simply that thousands of people were living outside colonial control, though that was already a serious economic concern. The danger was what Palmares proved, that the slave system could be defied, that escape was possible and didn't have to end in capture, that an organized life existed beyond the plantation. Every person who made it to Palmares was one fewer person in the productive system. But more than that, Palmares was evidence that the fear holding everything together was not absolute, that control had cracks, that there was another side. For decades, colonial authorities sent expeditions to destroy the Mocambos. Some managed to burn settlements, capture people, and inflict damage. But Palmares rebuilt. The geography helped, and so did the ability of its people to move, reorganize, and raise again what had been torn down. The period of Dutch occupation in Pernambuco during the first half of the 17th century added another layer of regional instability that paradoxically gave Palmares time and space to consolidate. By the time the Portuguese retook control of the northeast and could concentrate their resources again, Palmares was already too large to ignore and too difficult to dismantle easily. That was the world Ganga Zumba operated in. He was the most recognized leader of Palmares in the latter half of the 17th century, and under his leadership, the community reached one of its most organized phases. In 1678, Ganga Zumba negotiated an agreement with the colonial authorities of Pernambuco. The exact terms vary depending on the source, but the core of the deal was that certain parts of Palmares would receive land and freedom in exchange for accepting specific conditions, including the possibility of returning runaways who arrived after the agreement was signed. For Ganga Zumba, it may have been a way to buy time, stabilize the situation, and protect those already inside the community. For many of Palmares's inhabitants, it was a line that could not be crossed. The agreement split the community. Not everyone was willing to accept conditions handed down by the same system that had hunted them. Out of that political tension, the figure of Zumbi dos Palmares rose to the foreground. He rejected the deal and became the voice of those who believed no negotiation was possible with a system built on enslavement. Ganga Zumba died shortly afterward, under circumstances that colonial sources attribute to poisoning by members of Palmares itself, though the full story remains contested. Zumbi took central leadership, and Palmares entered a phase of more direct resistance, with no political agreement left on the table. Military expeditions continued and grew more intense. In 1694, the colonial government launched the largest and best-equipped offensive Palmares had ever faced. The column that reached the Serra da Barriga had artillery, numbers, the formal backing of the authorities, and the resolve not to turn back again. The assault on Macaco lasted days. The defenders held with what they had. Colonial chronicles, which remain the most detailed sources available, describe an intense battle and a defeat that was neither quick nor without cost for the attacking side. Macaco was destroyed. Survivors who could not escape were captured or killed. Some accounts record that a number of inhabitants chose to fall from the cliffs rather than be taken prisoner. Zumbi managed to escape, but not for long. In November of 1695, he was tracked down and killed. His head was taken to Recife and put on public display, a gesture that was simultaneously a political statement. The colonial order confirming it had recovered control, that the challenge was over. It was also, though no one acknowledged it at the time, a measure of just how much fear that community had generated over nearly a century. The destruction of Macaco did not end all quilombos, nor did it end resistance. Palmares had been the largest, most enduring, and most visible case, but it was not the only place where enslaved people had sought and built lives outside the system. What disappeared was that concrete point of reference, that visible network that had functioned for decades as proof of what was possible. But the memory held. Palmares came to occupy a place in Afro-Brazilian and Latin American history that no military expedition could erase. Not as a perfect myth, but as something more durable. Evidence that a persecuted community, built by people the system denied every right, could organize, govern, defend itself, and survive across generations. The freedom Palmares embodied did not come from a law, a proclamation, or a concession. It was built through flight, through the jungle, through the defense of a territory, and through the daily choices of people who refused to be taken back. That is what the empire could not fully destroy, even when it tore down the walls.